First, Barbary War. There were 4 Barbary states in North Africa: Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Morocco was an independent kingdom. The 3 others were loosely connected to the Ottoman Empire. Morocco was willing to negotiate a peace without tribute in 1786. In 1785, Algiers declared war on the U.S. and attacked several U.S. ships which were no longer protected by the British Navy, and in 1789 the U.S. adopted the Constitution. This allowed the taxes necessary for the federal government to buy off the Algerians. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson refused to pay tribute to Tripoli and sent an invasion force, and in 1805 the U.S. didn't pay tribute to Tripoli. But it is important to recognize that the reason the Barbary states could be bought off, it's because there were states. And the reason the piracy was so systematic is that it was state-sponsored. That said, American merchants could rent escorts from the Dutch and Spanish in the Mediterranean, and while the Spanish galleons were obsolete against other European navies by then, they could still destroy the Barbary dinghies without much trouble. That is, the Spanish ships were obsolete, but the Barbary states' warships were even more obsolete. The Barbary pirates would attack merchants, even if they flew the flag of a country that paid tribute, and so the only sure way to not be attacked would be to rent an escort. And ships that aren't being used cost money to just sit around. If merchants across the board rented escorts, then Barbary pirates would either have to find a way to beat the escorts, in which case there'd be no more raids, but everything would have to be a naval battle, or the pirates would have to find productive jobs, and likely would just end up selling off their fixed capital, like the ships or the weaponry needed to do what they do. In response, less merchants would buy escorts, though new would-be pirates would have to acquire ships all over again, and it would be unlikely that they would gain enough booty to cover the cost of a new ship before the merchants started hiring escorts again. The economics of the Barbary Wars just don't make any sense. But of course, neither did the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion, which did not result in the federal government being able to collect the tax. What other motives could the U.S. federal government have had for starting a war against the Barbary states? The United States government had just signed the Naval Act and recommissioned the Navy in 1794, and the conclusion of the war was a successful military adventure by the U.S. government. The War of 1812 started on June 18th, 1812. The modus of the war was the conscription of American sailors to serve in the British Navy, the Royal Navy, who at the time had a shortage of experienced sailors while they were fighting the war with Napoleon. Many British sailors defected during the Revolutionary War to the Americans because the Americans paid better. British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval was the main advocate of this policy, which was very unpopular in Britain and viewed as suicidal, as it would lead to a war against America. Perceval was unwilling to negotiate with the United States. On May 11, 1812, Perceval was assassinated and replaced by Robert Jenkinson, often referred to as Lord Liverpool. Jenkinson was willing to stop the conscription, but we are told that Congress didn't know about this at the time they declared war. The United States Congress declared war on Britain 38 days later, 38 days after the assassination of Perceval and the appointment of Robert Jenkinson, and their first move of the war was to invade Canada. The United States Army was very much unprepared, but was thrust into war, and it should go without saying that the British Army in Canada was likewise unprepared. Because Britain was waging a war against Napoleon, they had few troops to spare, yet were still able to repel the American invasion of Canada. By 1815, after Napoleon had abdicated in Europe, the British were able to spare the needed troops to make 3 attacks into the United States. The first attack was toward Baltimore. The British were able to capture and burn down Washington, D.C., but were unable to capture their main objective of Baltimore and sailed back up to Canada. The second was an attack toward New York, but they were defeated in the attack at Plattsburgh in Pennsylvania, I believe. And the third attack was up through New Orleans, but were defeated at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, some questions need asking. If the modus of the war was the conscription of American sailors, and Jenkinson was willing to stop the conscription, why didn't Congress try to negotiate as soon as they learned of Jenkinson's appointment? Even if they didn't know of Jenkinson's appointment the moment they declared war, they certainly knew that Jenkinson was appointed by 1813 and that he was willing to end the conscription. Another question is, why would Congress declare war and invade Canada when the United States Army was in such a shoddy condition? Why wouldn't they pass an act to build up the Army like they did with the Navy, with the Naval Act in 1794? What was the rush at precisely that moment? And if the sailors were the reason for the rush to war, why wasn't there a rush to war a year sooner? Why was there only a rush to war 38 days after Percival's death? Like, why did Congress rush to war? Or let me put it this way. Why did Congress rush to war as soon as they got news of Percival's death and the appointment of Prime Minister Jenkinson, who was willing to negotiate, thus eliminating the modus for declaring war on Britain? Well, to ask that is to ask it like that is to answer it. The U.S. Congress wanted an excuse to declare war on Britain and invade Canada. During the Revolutionary War, Washington invaded Canada, believing they would defect to the United States, and wisely the Canadians did not. It took about 3 weeks for news to cross the Atlantic in 1812, and it took some time for news to cross overland. That's 21 days by sea plus 17 days by land for the U.S. Congress to hear of Percival's death before they declared war. And the death of the Prime Minister, that's news that's going to be spread basically as fast as people can travel. They learned of Percival's death, but the U.S. Army was unprepared for war. They didn't have time to rebuild the U.S. Army sooner. They had to declare war fast before the public got wind of it, right? But news of Percival's death and Jenkinson's ending the conscription policy would soon spread through the colonies. Thus, the U.S. Congress had to stop Jenkinson from ending the conscription policy lest they lose their excuse for war. And the only way to do that was to declare war on Britain before peace could emerge.